I'm kinda hooked on games where you conquer the map and get to see the changes made as you do so. Far Cry, Homefront the Revolution, Just Cause, they all scratch a special kind of itch, but they never really let you control anything about the faction you help build. You're kinda just their Doom guy. Then you've got things like Mountain Blade or Starpoint Gemini Warlords, with bits of overworld 4X strategy and management on top of RTS systems that also support first or third-person combat. These games are great, but in the realm of console titles, the niche markets don't have the opportunity to build the traction that they do on PC. So we'll be looking at more than just a couple of solid Xbox games today. I even had to update Steam. From the tempered pace of snatching up star bases in SPG Warlords to the frantic infantry clashes of Total Conflict, you've got quite a few options at this point. And all of these games share the fact that you always have the choice to fight on the line in your engagements. You're never forced to take a back seat and see how it plays out. So that's where we're going to be starting out to look at all of these titles: force building and combat. Sometimes you gotta build a space boat. Others, you gotta wait for your fiefs to, make more people. Either way, building an army for a land grab takes time. So has anyone perfected the system? That kinda depends on what you're looking for. Mountain Blade takes a pretty practical approach, in that villages with higher population and economic prosperity provide more opportunities to recruit high-tier troops, and smaller rural settlements offer fewer lower-tier troops, encouraging rulers to support their settlements and mercenaries to recruit from the core cities of an empire. Tailworlds has had a while to build this out, seeing as the first Mountain Blade was dropped back in 2008 and received support until the release of its sequel in 2020. And at this point it does sort of sit as the standard for a lot of similar titles. On basically the other end of the spectrum, SPG Warlords has a pretty brute force resource-based army builder. As long as you can pull in enough ore and materials, you can sustain a pretty staggering rate of attrition. With the main focus of the game being combat, you're also able to give your fleets a lot more autonomy than most of these titles allow. You can build and deploy swarms of gunships to soften up a station or an enemy fleet before you pull up with your proper line vessels, or focus on a single massive fleet of cruisers and dreadnoughts to cut a swath through enemy territory. I do tend to lean more into the multiple balanced fleets to attempt tactically elegant advances that turn into aimless brawls camp, but you've got a ton of flexibility in fleet organization to figure out your preferred style. The two with the most overlap on the combat front are most definitely Total Conflict Resistance and Freeman Guerrilla Warfare, but they take wildly different approaches to army building and organization. Leading with Freeman, it very much takes the Mountain Blade route of buy cheap troops and work to upgrade, or buy fancy troops that can carry you in battle. You've got a custom player character that leads your force and acts as the head of your tiny little faction, and must complete jobs to earn cash and rep in order to buy or train better fighters. Total Conflict takes a more grand strategy stance with its army building though. You have to buy or produce the ammo, food, armor, and uniforms to outfit your infantry. Vehicles require fuel, tanks and heavy weapons use specialized ammo that is more resource intensive to produce, requiring a bit of thought on which battalions are mechanized and which are infantry focused, and if you don't have the logistics to support a unit on the front lines, they won't regenerate from wounds suffered in battle. You also have to station a battalion at a town or a city in order for them to recruit after suffering casualties. It's like Risk if you actually got to play one of the little guys on the board and had to dodge RPGs and indirect fire. Not going to touch on Shadow of War just yet, because the army building is kind of the entire game outside of the story, but it really doesn't share anything with a lot of the games on this list. I do, however, want to shoehorn in Kenshi for a moment before moving on. This didn't make it into the video proper because I f***ing suck at it, but we are getting there. It's pretty much the definition of open-ended sandbox, where you can conquer or coexist with whoever you choose. There is going to be a video on this one eventually, I just gotta learn how not to get kidnapped. Total Conflict and Freeman share a lot of DNA on this point. Upon deploying your troops, you have a choice between FPS or overhead RTS camera views. Troop direction on the map in Freeman is excellent, but Total Conflict really takes the show with being able to command while fighting. Freeman requires you to do all of your movement commands from a map view, which isn't too much of an issue as the AI works pretty well in combat, but really doesn't respond well to micromanaging for tactical purposes. Total Conflict, however, gives you control of all squads in both FPS and RTS views, meaning it makes for far more decisive strategies while on the field. Both games offer a decent first-person combat experience, with Total Conflict building more on a cinematic combined arms effect with armored units and abundant air support, but both do most of what you need to have a little bit of fun in a gunfight. Mount & Blade also uses a more refined version of the first-person command system like Total Conflict employs, but focused for medieval combat. Units are extremely responsive to formation commands, and the movement commands allow accurate placement of which troops you want and where you want them. Basically, every game I play with FPS or TPS squad commands, I always hope they work as well as Mount & Blade, and they seldom do. Being in a shield wall when the cavalry charges you, the clashing of swords and thumps of axes being buried in leather, you keep your guard high to ward off mounted knights as your line breakers begin hacking away at the enemy flank. Say what you will about features that we're still waiting on, but the combat is pretty impressive, and your hero standing upon the walls, covered in what's left of the attackers after crushing an enemy assault, is particularly satisfying. Drifting way into the future, we've got the slow, grinding zero-gravity engagements of SPG warlords. Corvettes and gunships feel nimble, able to maneuver and roll around enemy capital ships. Cruisers are a balance of a wide arc of fire with medium armament and some decent speed. And then there are capital-class vessels. Tons of guns, torpedoes and heavy weapons on every surface. The woes of a small arc of engagement are foregone for a lack of speed and a surplus of belligerent firepower. Deploy multiple wings of fighters to harass the enemy picket fleet as you shred their garrison station with literally too many railguns. I really like space, and any excuse to fly an absurdly big ship through the stars is a perfectly good one, despite being a pretty buggy experience on here. Options are limited for Space Conquest on console, but at least Warlords is a decent one, offering plenty of playstyles and ways to arm up your fleet. And then the outlier, Shadow of War. It's only marginally a Conquest game in the sense that these others are, but is also almost entirely a Conquest game, still unlike the others in basically any way. Whereas our other Conquest-capades all have you ramp up to lead a government of some sort, Shadow of War is a refined soup of combat, consisting mostly of the parts you chop off of the orcs throughout the game. They've got some of that overly smooth swordplay that we all loved in The Witcher, with more violence than any Tolkien adaptation has ever been able to muster up. This game is stuffed with gravitas. Every fight feels like it is the one, and having to break an enemy in combat in order to recruit them is absolutely awesome. I do feel like this is more of a great slasher that uses a conquest and nemesis system to drive the story, more than a game built on conquering a continent. But each part of it requires all of the others to work in unison for such a solid, complete experience. These games all do large-scale combat, but that's not unique to them. If that's all you need, there's a whole storm of other titles that can give you that without the time sink that comes from stuff with the heavy management elements that these have. Darktide and Running with Rifles are both regulars in my rotation for this reason, but those don't require you to make sure the squad is fed and equipped, and frankly, that's why we're here today. Mount & Blade takes a simpler casual route. You just need food and money for your warriors, while SPGW basically forgoes any need to resupply a fleet after building it, aside from units, and not requiring you to do much of anything to maintain your cities and residential stations. Mount & Blade does, however, have a number of resources for cities, requiring you to build facilities to train town guard for increasing security or spending cash on festival grounds so that you can have celebrations and raise the spirits of your citizens. Freeman does sort of lift this system, but imitation is the most sincere form of flattery, right? It works well for the setting, and I will say that the game treats it more as a supplement to the core combat module rather than being as much of a major element as it is in Mount & Blade, while Total Conflict leans into empire management as a whole. You have to maintain supply lines between battalions outside of cities. Troops consume everything from first aid kits and food to reservists and any compatible ammo in use by the battalion. City garrisons require a mix of equipment to supply and maintain them as police forces, and shipyards need iron and copper for building your navy. You can brute force your lines forward with numbers, or spend the cash and outfit your guys like a proper military force, then flex your grand strategy muscles on snatching a few cities. Of all these titles on this list, this one really nails the feeling of running a country at war. Spend the resources on a new distillery to keep your populace in sport of your endless war, or drop a munitions factory in your capital because those idiots in 73rd Bat used 8,000 rounds of 7.62 in a fight with 30 rebels. It's a bit stressful, but it's a good kind of stressful. Provided that's a thing. And once again, we're back to the other guy. Shadow of War doesn't do a whole lot in this ring. The game is really focused on the experience of Talion taking part in the fight for Mordor, and the survival of the inhabitants of Middle-earth. The other games kind of put you in a position to fight a pretty self-serving conflict. You want to rule, so you build an army and you take the lands from your neighbors. In Shadow of War, you start out learning to lose. Minas Ithil is in ruins. Talion, while capable with his little elvish buddies backup, is just a dude that can't stop it from getting worse. You make deals with monsters, you fight as dirty as the Uruk to break their captains and make them serve the Army of Light, and get some revenge against Sauron while hopefully securing a place for the elves and humans that wish to call this their home. You don't have the option of tactically elegant advances. You're fighting on orc terms, and that means a raw show of force. Recruit who you can, you kill who you can't, and you smash the walls that keep the war chiefs safe. Taking up a high spot on the field as you watch your army march in to crush the remaining captains trying to hold the line is one of the most alive-looking battlefields I think we've seen to date on console. But while conquering is an absolutely core part of Shadow of War, it isn't really a conquest game. It's a heavy open-world adventure with massive depth offered by the backdrop of Middle-earth at war, and we love it for that. These all give you the whole experience, from starting as an undermanned force, trying to make a name for yourself, to sitting on a throne and pulling the strings. But I feel like they all peak at a point before you have it all. I tend to feel that these games really demonstrate the arc that massive games tend to follow. By the end, you're inundated with the needs of your cities or citizens. Your nobles or generals are crushing the last of your enemies, while you take leave of the front to keep a handle on the dozens of settlements now looking to you for guidance. Bannerlord is, once again, my preferred example. When you have one or two cities under your banner, they help bankroll your campaigns. They give you a place to store high-tier troops so that you don't lose your line-breaking abilities, and as you slowly acquire more fiefs, you feel like they appropriately extend your reach as a ruler. However, once your tendrils of leadership begin reaching a little too far, you quickly realize that your clan is out fighting the wars and you're tied up sprinting between ends of your empire trying to get food to starving citizens. SPGW, while suffering from slightly different woes, is no less guilty. By the late game, travel times are the big annoyance. Surprise, surprise, a star system is pretty damn big. And even with warp gates around most major regions, you spend a lot of time in sublight going from point A to point B. By that time, you do have a selection of shipyards from which to assemble a fighting force, so you can always get bodies to wherever they're needed. But you miss out on some of those big tasty line ship fights because you gotta burn T-drives on getting a picket fleet to your southernmost outpost before raiders just steal it again. It's sort of the goal with a game like this, though. You can't conquer a whole continent and then hang them out to dry. We all do want to get to that point, but upon reaching it, we realized that we wanted the trip there more than it. And maybe that's kind of a commentary on gaming as a whole. No matter how much you like the ending of a game, we all hate that a game has ended. But thankfully, most of the titles on here really benefit from a few playthroughs. Test out the other factions, leave your comfort zone, and learn some new strategies. So don't feel bad about that save gathering dust while you make your next trip into the Gemini system, the island of Cherniv, or even an old-fashioned hike in Calradia. Thanks for tagging along today, and we'll see you next time on the Horizon Initiative.